Hello there, this is Professor Radinger Dodderman. Welcome to the tutorial on essay number 1. This is just a very brief tutorial to help you with some tips for framing your definition that you are presenting in your first paper. I realize that at this point you are probably midway through the readings that you will incorporate into your draft of essay number 1, and by now you're probably starting to think about how to fit all of these things together in preparation for writing the paper. And so there are a few tips that I would like to point you toward. The first thing that I want to talk to you about are two models of disability. The models of disability that emerge, particularly in the first two readings, are not the only way you can approach the paper, but I think a very helpful way to approach the paper. And these models are, of course, the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. So what I want to do is just kind of to recap these models of disability for you from the readings. The discussion of the medical model of disability primarily emerges through Longmore's essay. Most of our thinking about disability does reflect the medical model. If you think to the discussion board we began the class with, where I asked you to post the words that come to mind when you think about disability, probably 95% of the words or descriptions of disability that were included in your posts were words that were primarily negative. They suggested limitation, they suggested brokenness, pain, various diseases or conditions, and that's absolutely fine. That there's a reason for that. It is because that is how we think about disability, particularly in United States culture. Thus, disability is regarded primarily as a negative experience or something which one would want to avoid. Disability in our country is often thought of as being either separate from identity or as a source of stigma. For example, we often look at people who are disabled who manage to have some success in spite of disability, and instead of pointing to them as a proud disabled person, we always talk about them as having overcome their disability. That is, their identity or what is good about them has emerged in spite of this disability. Um, Alternately, we don't make that separation between somebody and their disability. And when we don't do that, at least in medical model thinking, primarily it is because disability has become a source of stigma. This most often happens, I think, in the cases of cognitive disability or mental disability. So, for example, one of the words that has fortunately passed into taboo as a way to describe somebody who has an intellectual impairment is, of course, the R word. We would say that somebody is retarded, and we historically have even used the word retarded as an insult. Oh, that's retarded, or oh, so and so is retarded. Of course, we don't use that word anymore, or at least people are becoming more aware of how hurtful that word is and aren't using it anymore. Um, but that has been something that has been regarded as part of an individual's identity, uh, but as a way of stigmatizing them. Similarly, we still are a long way away from not using insults related to mental illness or mental disability as a way of um, identifying somebody in a way that is stigmatizing. So we think about somebody who, say, has schizophrenia, and we say, oh, well, that woman is crazy. And crazy is identified as something that is integral to who that person is. But it's in a way that is stigmatizing, not in a way that is positive. A contrast with that would be somebody like Temple Grandin, whose video you may choose to view as part of the autism studies readings that are provided. Um, Temple Grandin has said, I am my autism. And when she says that, she's not identifying her autism as an identity that is terrible or negative. She acknowledges both that it is a disability, but for her, it is integral to her identity in a way that she perceives as primarily positive, and that is not something that the medical model traditionally does. To that end, because it is primarily negative, we in medical model thinking think about disability as something that requires cure, correction, confinement, or elimination. So if we have a condition that we can cure, we certainly uh, we certainly urge people to be cured if they have a condition that can be cured in some way. If they can't be cured outright, then we encourage them to be corrected. So let's say somebody is born with a limb deformity. We would insist, or we would advise that that person undergo cosmetic surgery or corrective surgery, if not to restore the function of the limb, then to make the limb more normal in appearance, or we would advise them to use a prosthesis so that that limb is more normal in appearance. Um, if someone can't be cured or corrected, historically, our approach to that has been to confine them, to quarantine them, to keep them away from others. So this country has a long history of institutionalization where we have kept not only people who perhaps had mental illness and perhaps required a facility to keep them safe, to keep them from hurting themselves or others. We have also relegated to those facilities at various points in history anybody who was different. In the 1950s, if there was a child who was born with Down syndrome, or who was born with autism, or even who was born with cerebral palsy, who might have otherwise typical cognitive function, that person would be sent off to an institution where he or she would remain probably his or her whole life. More recently, we do less of that, but we do still confine people. If you think about our practice of educating children, we still use confinement in the form of special schools or in the form of what we call self-contained classrooms, where we keep children with what we determine to be severe disabilities or disruptive disabilities in separate educational environments from children who are typical. Um, Finally, of course, there are different manifestations of elimination. So, the most widely used and accepted form of elimination of disability in this country is, of course, prenatal testing and screening for disabilities, and then the selective termination to eliminate fetuses who we can predict will be born with those disabilities. When in other times and places, elimination has taken different forms. Certainly, there are extreme forms of that. Genocide has been used by various regimes. Everybody is familiar with Hitler uh, to eliminate people who had disabled bodies. Um, but even in our current climate, we still support, in some cases, elimination through euthanasia of disabled bodies, or bodies that we believe are so hopelessly impaired that they are beyond any reasonable pursuit of cure or treatment. So that is how the medical model really regards disability and some of the various manifestations of that. The social model of disability, which becomes clear, actually in several readings, it becomes clear, of course, in Longmore's reading, as well as in The Social Model of Disability by Tom Shakespeare, and really is a central model that is represented in Strauss's essay Autism as Culture as well. In the social model of disability, disability is separate from impairment. Impairment may be located in the body, but disability is created by our interactions with others. So, in other words, the social model argues that um, there might be a difference in the body, but that itself is not a disabling factor, that difference in the body, can be an impairment. So let's say you can't walk. That's not a disability in the social model. That is an impairment. The disability is that you're living in a world that is designed for people who can walk. And the way that we cure disability on the social model is through accommodation and respect. So accommodation, for example, for a person who can't walk, extends to providing accessible transportation. It extends to designing buildings so that they're wheelchair accessible. It perhaps extends to providing um, financial support for healthcare um, and various assistances that are needed for somebody who is living in a body that can't walk, that often will experience different physical needs than a typical person's body will. Um, that is the way that the social model of disability would think of disability. It also acknowledges disability as a positive component of an individual's personhood. So, like Grandin saying, I am my autism, that is her seeing autism, or what we think of as a disability, as a central and positive part of her identity. If you happen to, a little bit later in the semester, watch the video, Sound and Fury, in that video you will hear a deaf man say that he likes being deaf and he was happy when his children were born deaf. He clearly doesn't see deafness as a disability. He sees deafness as just a difference, like having a particular racial background or a particular ethnic background or being of a particular gender, just one factor that can make up who you are. He sees deafness as just being that, not as something that is disabling, and certainly not as something that is negative. So how do you put this all into a paper? There are a few different approaches. The first thing I want to stress before you get started is that this is a synthesis essay. So what I don't want is a paper that gives me a dictionary definition of disability and then just kind of talks about the ratings. That's not the point of the assignment. The synthesis essay is asking you to create the definition through a synthesis of the readings. So when you look at the readings, and you need to use 2 of the course readings in this assignment, what emerges to you as that definition? You might argue that disability is socially constructed, i.e., you might write a paper supporting the social model of disability. You might argue that disability is located in the body, which is very similar to the medical model of disability. You may argue that disability consists of both social and medical components, and so you're arguing it's not one or the other, it's a combination of both. All of those are fine. Another approach that doesn't happen to fit within one of these 3 descriptions is also fine, as long as you are accomplishing the goal of creating synthesis of texts and of defining disability. Just some key points that might help you. One thing that can be really important, that I have noticed in Longmore is the way the Longmore talks about the fact that society benefits from the medicalization of disability. There's a part in his essay where he talks about the fact that it's not just simply that the bodies are different, but that the medicalization of disability has given birth to an entire industry, and that industry has a vested interest in continuing to maintain disability as, excuse me, something that is negative. We have in Shakespeare his concept of the barrier-free utopia, where he talks about, he's criticizing the social model of disability, and he says that social model disability thinking says, well, disability is created by people. And Shakespeare, of course, says, well, that's kind of true, but it's also not entirely true. There are some disabilities that are, or some impairments that are so profoundly affecting that they really can become disabling in and of themselves. On the other hand, you have somebody like William Peace, who's criticizing Christopher Reeve's pursuit of cure, and he argues that awareness and access are more important than cure. So he's more of a social model person. And likewise, you have Strauss, who argues that autism only exists in relation to other people. Um, he explains that autism is a series of social characteristics that exist in everyone, but in autistic people they exist disproportionately. And so it is our social definition of these characteristics. Oh, sorry about that. Our social definition of these characteristics that makes us see them as excessive. Um, in other words, you can't have autism or you can't have a social disability without other people there to tell you that your behavior is socially abnormal. Otherwise, you're all by yourself. You're not socially abnormal in relation to yourself. You're socially abnormal in relation to other people. So that is how Strauss might connect to this paper. Um, what you should do is you should look for ways that these sources speak to each other. So it's always good if you can draw connections between multiple texts in relation to a point that you're making in your paper. Something else I think that also can be useful is not just to think about your use of these texts as being in agreement to them. So, in other words, if you wish to argue that disability really is located in the body, and you want to talk about that in relation to Peace's essay, well, Peace isn't making that claim at all. Peace is saying that really the disabling factor is this lack of access. But you could introduce Peace or introduce a statement by Peace and argue against that as a way of espousing your definition of disability as an impairment. So that's something else to think about. That's it. I hope that you have found this helpful. As you have questions moving forward, please feel free to ask them. And good luck as you craft your essay number 1.